Okay, so I think we can start the meeting. Okay, so can you hear me properly? Yes.
Yes.
Fine. Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for those who are in India. So welcome all to this event that is run by Indigenous Studies Discussion Group at University of Cambridge. So thank you for joining us today. And first, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction about the discussion group. This event was possible thanks to the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge. And our group, Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, in brief ISDG, is a student-led initiative with the aim to promote scholarship by and about Indigenous people across disciplines. So today event is about present day missions in the post-colonial context. I'd like to introduce very brief myself before starting. So I am Marilena Proietti, and I am affiliate member to the group and a PhD student at Sapienza University of Rome in Italy. And my PhD research is about the different nature of indigenous women's movements with a special focus on Eastern India. And so I'm here today to moderate this meeting that, as I said before, is about the present-day missions in the post-colonial context. So we will discuss about the cultural, political, geopolitical aspects that shape the contemporary missionary activities in countries or regions marked by a history of colonialism. And today we will focus especially on two geographical areas that are East Africa and East India, or India as a whole. And I have the honor today to have two scholars here to talk about this topic. So I'm going to introduce them. So first of all, thank you to Vincent and Theo to be here. And so the first scholar is going to talk is Father Dr. Vincent Ekka. So he is the head of the Department of Tribal Studies at Indian Social Institute in New Delhi, and he is an assistant professor at the same institute. He obtained his doctorate in social sciences from JNU University in New Delhi, and his areas of interest are indigenous communities and their knowledge system, indigenous system of self-governance, and indigenous perspectives. And his interests and engagements have been interdisciplinary with a special focus on indigenous studies. And our second speaker is Theo Stapleton, a PhD candidate at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. His research was conducted at the first official Buddhist institution from the People's Republic of China in East Africa, Tanhua Monastery. And his research is based on 12 months of participant observation in Dar es Salaam as a Chinese Swahili translator. And he was able to gain deep access into the mission's monastery and its growing list of charitable projects. And he's currently writing up his PhD dissertation, which will be submitted in 2025. So, Dr. Vincent Ekka will go first and he will talk about the context of Christian mission in the geopolitical landscape of post-colonial India that is characterized by mutual settlement of impending conflicts through interfaith dialogue. And he will also focus in particular on indigenous Adivasi context, offering insights for his own personal experience and understanding as both indigenous Adivasi and Christian. So I will give the floor to Vincent to start the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Marilena, for the brief introduction and welcoming us to this platform. Dear friends, I'm very happy to be here at this platform and share some of my experiences by way of presenting on the topic that I was given to. And I'll be speaking about present day mission in the post-colonial context, geopolitics, migration, and interfaith dialogue. As already Marilena introduced, I am Vincent Ekka, belonging to Koduh Urao tribe, indigenous community of India. I thank the organizers of Indigenous Study Discussion Group for giving me an opportunity to speak on this topic. I'll be first speaking about the mission and its history and how over the years till post-independent India, how it has evolved in India, and also the geopolitics that has been going on, and how the migration is happening within country and also outside a country from India in the state and intra-states and so, and also how interfaith is a necessary requirement in today's multicultural and multi-religious communities like India. So this is the context that I'm going to talk today. As far as the history of Christianity is concerned, its history goes back to the beginning of Christian era itself, as early as 52 AD, as it is said that Saint Thomas, the apostle of Jesus, came to India in 52 AD. And that's how India became one of the first countries in the world to receive the message of Christ soon after the death of Christ. So this is so centuries old Christianity in India, we can say. Then subsequently other groups were sent and they came here, preached the message of gospel in different times. Thomas of Cana came here. Then we also are told that Emperor Constantine deputed Theophilus to India in 354 AD to preach the gospel. So as early as that, there was a continuity of sending missionaries to this country called India. And we find in the later stage, around 15th, 16th century, it gained more ground as many other missionaries came. And with the coming of Francis Xavier in 1542, it really accelerated spreading out the mission in whole of India, especially in the southern part of the country. And between 1535 to 1537, many people were they accepted Christianity, and later on also that continued even after independence in 1947. That continues as many countries from Portugal, from Belgium, from USA, from France, from many other countries, missionaries came at different points of time in different parts of the country. Some diversity of Indian realities I would like to talk about, because India seems to be like a melting pot of different cultures and communities. And also we find in Indian ethos uh, uh, deeply ingrained hierarchical structures and systems. We also find there are people who are always on the controlling helm. They want to be on the top of the ruling elite, and they want to be always on that class. And also we see there are some class of people who are forever condemned to be at the service of the so-called higher class people or higher caste people. We also find there are people who are deprived of their rights and privileges, and they are not allowed to rise up in life. We also find in Indian population that there is a sizable number of indigenous communities and peoples who live in close proximity with the natural surroundings, known as tribals, Adivasis, or indigenous peoples, scheduled tribes, nomadic, semi-nomadic. And also we have uh, PVTGs, particularly vulnerable tribal groups in our country. So varieties of more than 700 groups of indigenous communities are residing in India. So how these different groups of people were they touched or they came in contact with the Christian mission at a different points of history, and that impacted differently the different communities in before colonial period, during colonial period, and also post-colonial period. This continued in different measures and different ways. So the characteristic of Indian mission or Indian Christian mission, we can say, is a kind of bagged with Indian culture as well. So the age-old baggage of Indian psyche of caste and race that continued to be also in the Christian practice. And this hierarchical social category and kind of practice of high and low, rich and poor, that continued because this is deeply ingrained in the Indian psyche. So the impact of racialized worldview that was prevalent among European colonial powers, they also transmitted the colonial context to its communal social legacy within uh, Christianity, continued even to this day. So we find the imprint of long-lasting impact of this kind of race and caste and its distinction and discrimination that is seen even today in the Christian community. After independence, when or even before independence, when the colonial regime was here in India, they came in touch with the people called indigenous communities or tribals or Adivasis in the remote areas of forests and hills and jungles and so on. And when the people found that these missionaries are imparting education, they are empowering people, and they were attracted towards this movement called Christianity at that point of time, and there were many people accepted it. So there was kind of drive and movement where people came in groups and accepted because they found a more liberating factor in the Christian practice and teaching. So when the Christian mission reached the most oppressed and marginalized people like the Dalits and tribals who were culturally and geographically marginalized were deeply attracted by the Christian mission of Western education, health services, teaching of social equality, and also with equal dignity and respect. So these things attracted people who were oppressed and exploited by the so-called elite of the country. So this Christianity empowered tribals and it helped them to come up in their life, and therefore they uh, came in front of the missionaries to support them and also welcome them among them. And that's how we find the missionaries coming into the remotest areas and adapting the culture of the people, learning the language, translating the Bible into different indigenous languages in Mundari, in Kadiya, in Ho, Urao, Santali, and many other indigenous languages. The Bible was translated and the message was communicated to people. And through establishment of educational institutions, various other empowerment programs, training programs, people were really empowered, and that's how they were attracted and drawn towards accepting Christianity more and more. So this is a kind of drive we see how people got a kind of liberation and that transformation in accepting and practicing the Christian faith. So that's how it brought about a social change and transformation, which brought about a kind of upheaval in the Indian society, where there was a kind of hierarchical structure, there was a kind of defined roles and uh, responsibilities, and that got affected by this kind of empowerment of people through the Christianity. So the social welfare and other empowerment program really brought about changes, and that's how it got kind of also appreciation. And also, on the other hand, we see how they were also accused of various other things of empowering people or engaging into some kind of activity which is not in keeping with the national ethos and the practice and the structure of the nation. So that's how there were also oppositions and there was also support from various corners. This period from 1872 to 1914, that can be really called as a period of educational awakening of Christian tribals. These schools developed a curriculum that suited them and incorporated uh, animal care, local herbal medicine, land measurement in its ramified form, carpentry, blacksmithing, weaving, reading, writing, mathematics, history, geography, physics, and religion. All these uh, different disciplines were brought to the people, and people got educated into various streams and learnings. This brought about a lot of change on the one hand on the people, but on the other hand, we find a kind of suspicion from the ruling elite. Therefore, this the geopolitics that uh, we find in Indian subcontinent, this geopolitical position of India appears to be based on a very dangerously deterministic strategy with struggle for supremacy and exceptionalism. This is a very much seen over the years in Indian history, in the Indian people. India over the years has exercised a distinct political agency. It has offered India's strategy of managing and turbulent managing the turbulence of the present global order that can be seen as a return to a story of civilizing greatness of the state, popularly known as the Ram Raj, what we see today. A drive to return towards that kind of past glory. In the name of unification and nationalism, attempts are made to suppress diversity of cultures, communities, and religious practices, which is the result of a very narrow geopolitics and policies. So this we find how this is in operation in various parts of the country. The crisis in the various parts of India, like Manipur, Bastar, border regions, religions and ethnic conflicts within the country itself are a result of a narrow geopolitics and strategy of the ruling elite. So India has an opportunity actually to either take all people together or harp on a kind of the oppressive structure that was prevalent at historical points of time, which is some who still want to hold on to it. So the Asian geopolitical structures are interdependent. When we see the geopolitical and geographical conditions from Iran to Thailand, whole of the Asian regions, we find there is a kind of structure of interdependence. So India must exercise an agency within such coexisting multiverse or pluriverse geopolitics by prioritizing connections rather than exclusion, what we see today, prudential agency rather than geopolitical determinism, and focus on outcomes that bring prosperity to the masses rather than enriching handful individuals and flaunting India's ambitions for international prestige in the make-believe emphasis on becoming a Vishwaguru. So on the one hand, we find that there is a kind of opportunity to show a magnanimity of heart, of prioritizing connection, taking all towards equal development and also equal opportunities. On the other hand, we find there is also a movement of exclusion and also a kind of determinism that is excluding many and many more people in the Indian subcontinent, which has created uneven and unequal type of development and discontent among people, and that has led to fly to different parts where there is greater opportunity. So then there is a kind of influx of people going to different countries and states. So migration becomes a kind of very rampant problem. And this migration in India is a result of narrow geopolitics. Although migration is a global phenomenon, but we see how this narrow geopolitics has forced people to migrate to different states in search of their livelihood. So there have been internal and external migration of people. There are also forced migrations and voluntary migration, where pull and push factors play important roles. So migration is important determinant of population change associated with demographic transition, urbanization, and economic development. It has a unique ability to transform the size, distribution, and composition of a national population. Migration could be temporary or permanent. We find how this is becoming a kind of global phenomenon, and global crisis is being created through this issue of migration. So the main regions of migration we see is uneven economic development, or aspiration for a better life, forced displacement, or voluntary migration, and many more we can think of. So both these permanent and temporary migration affect the composition of a particular locality, and how this creates a crisis of a massive scale that was witnessed at the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and which we saw the migration crisis that highlighted the poor understanding of the gravity of migration in India. So this created a kind of intermingling of the communities when people migrated in large numbers to other areas. So the population, its size, and different areas of lives were affected, and it changed the socio-cultural demography of different regions within the country itself. And therefore, people which had a kind of set patterns of life and lifestyle was disrupted by this kind of migrants, and also intermingling of different cultures and communities. So there was a kind of urgent need that was created, or that was needed, to have a common platform for all, a kind of equal platform where each one can participate, feel one among the communities wherever they are within the country. So that's how, in the realm of social behavior, interfaith dialogue becomes very, very important. So how in this crisis of migration and search for livelihood, this interfaith dialogue plays an important role of accepting people, of creating self-confidence, or it brings about a platform where people can feel one with the other communities and cultures. So the diversity of Indian cultures and communities, accelerated by the intermingling of forced and voluntary migrants, needed a common platform where people of all faith, traditions, cultures, races, castes, and ethnicity feel one and united. So interfaith dialogue played important role in bringing together uh, people of all faith. So either rich or poor, or high caste or low caste, belonging to any hierarchy or any cultural group, they could feel one at this kind of a platform. So that this was a kind of need of the hour. And we find India a tradition of interfaith dialogues in different cultures and communities, and also in religious traditions. So in Indian Sufism, we find that in the Islamic tradition, how Indian Sufism played an important role for created a ground for common platform for interfaith people coming together, experiencing same kind of acceptance. So the Sufism was a mystical and devotional branch of Islam which emphasized love, tolerance, and realization of truth through self-experience. So this was made available for people. Anybody could participate in it. Its basic principle was to emphasize on loving relationship, tolerance, and also sharing of one's experience with others. So where that invited and also extended its room for all participants. So Sufism sought union with the divine through meditation, music, and poetry, accepted and participated by all cultures and communities. And we find this tradition was very much prevalent in the 18th century. And some of the great Sufi saints we have is Baba Farid, Nizamuddin Aliya, Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti of Ajmer. So all these saints have promoted such a kind of sect of Sufism, which extended its welcome to one and all. So the basic principle was to promote mutual understanding of individuals or different cultures and communities. So tolerance becomes, love becomes, unity becomes a kind of undercurrent principles to bring all people. So this is Sufism. Abhishektananda Center for Interreligious Dialogue. There was
Vincent, sorry for interrupting you. So sorry. Just we are running out of time. So if you could finish in 1 minute.
Okay, yeah.
Thanks.
So
Thank you so
there
much.
are different interreligious dialogue centers in India. That was the need of the time. I think that was, so we have Delhi Brotherhood Society. We have Abhishektananda Center for Interreligious Dialogue. We have Interfaith Foundation India. We have Mahabodhi International Meditation Center, Darashiko Center for Interfaith Understanding and Dialogue. So these many dialogues and the centers, these are a few to illustrate, to give an example, but there are many more. The purpose of all these dialogue centers or interreligious dialogue centers are to promote peace, harmony, and dialogue between different religious groups, individuals, or communities. So the objective is very important, that creates a common platform. Therefore, the church also we find in the within the church 4 ways of interfaith dialogue, where we find a dialogue of life, dialogue of action, dialogue of religious experience, and dialogue of theological exchange. These 4 ways of interfaith dialogue the church promotes, and this is in keeping with the tradition of different interfaith dialogue centers in India and surrounding countries, how that is connecting people and bringing together for a kind of a platform, providing them to come together and share their religious experiences and also being enriched by each other. So this is the way that I think new way of being church or new way of being human can be seen through this kind of a practice where discrimination is not seen, differences are respected, diversities are respected, and where love, harmony, and just society becomes the slogan of the day. So I think this is a requirement of the time. That's why dialogue becomes very important for all cultures and communities. So with this, I wind up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vincent, for this very rich, I can say, presentation, because you gave a very detailed historical overview, so on how Christian missions operates in this highly complex geopolitical Indian landscape, I can say. So thank you so much. We will open the discussion after both the presentations, so we can ask if you have any questions to Vincent later, so after the 2 presentations. And so now I will give the floor to Theo, and today Theo will give a presentation regarding the Buddhist congregation at Tanwa Temple in Tanzania, led by a Tanzanian man collaborating with Chinese abbot. And so I give the floor to Theo to speak about other missions, so the Chinese Buddhist mission in another context, that is East Africa.
Thank you so much, Marilena, for that. And thank you, Dr. Vincent Ekka, for that fantastic discussion. It struck me that these topics seem far apart, but on the other hand, you know, they're very close. Buddhism coming from India over 2,500 years ago. And also the presentation we just heard about interreligious dialogue really put it in the long history of interreligious dialogue in the Indian and the subcontinent. And what we're going to have in my presentation is a very short and the start of what could be a long conversation. So I hope there's an interesting contrast in these discussions. So my presentation is a chapter from my PhD, which was the fieldwork was conducted in 2022, 2023. I did anthropological fieldwork, lived in the temple as a Swahili, Chinese, and English translator. So this temple, as Marilena has talked about, is the first Buddhist mission in East Africa from the PRC. So in this presentation, I'll first introduce the leader of the localization effort, so the Tanzanian leader of the temple. Then I will talk about how these discussions unfolded, how he led these discussions, and what they talked about. Thirdly, I'll look a little bit more about the material culture, taking some examples of Buddhist amulets and spirit possession to discuss the way that the cosmologies of these two different traditions, or these many traditions, were coming together. And then finally, turn to a theoretical section about what I came to understand as a sort of cosmopolitan ethic, or ethical project that was carried out by Joseph. Okay, so Tanzania's first Buddhist leader, as such, came into the temple in late 2022 and agreed to start running Sunday sessions in Swahili. But first, I want to give you a little bit of background about Joseph. So Joseph, he grew up Catholic, was educated in Dar es Salaam. In his early adult life, he also experimented with Islam. Christianity and Islam are almost equal in Tanzania in terms of number of adherents. He did biochemical engineering in Russia and learned Russian. He's been politically involved from his youth. He was even writing speeches for the ex-president of Tanzania, Magufuli. He reads incredibly widely. I mean, the books that he recommended to me included people like the philosopher Charles Nyamiti, or even Lobsang Rampa, and even a unionist preacher from America called Robert Ingersoll. So he reads incredibly widely and also writes his own short parables that he distributes to his sort of followers, or people who are reading his work. He's very spiritually disciplined. He told me about when he's facing problems, he sets himself ascetic tasks like picking up rubbish for a month at a time on the street. He has certain vows that he says helps him, like, not using luxury items or only taking public transport. And in some senses, he sees this as a spiritual journey to explain a prophecy, actually, that was given by his mother before he was born. And has sort of a goal that he puts as sort of creating a community, or what he calls a tribe, actually, in the long run. So it's worth keeping this in mind as we go through this material. So one day while we were in the field, Joseph said, I have to take you to a place that's very special to me in Dar es Salaam, which are these coffee spots. And they exist in the center of the city. There's a couple of them with particularly sort of intellectual debate communities. Now, Kai Kress has discussed this in Mombasa, in his book Philosophizing in Mombasa, and discusses the baraza, or the kijiwe cha kahawa. So the baraza is like this stone wall you see on the outside of traditional Swahili architecture. It's where people will come at certain times in the day, different age groups, and they will have like discussions. And the ones that we went to were particularly intellectual. They attract scholars, religious leaders from Islam and Christianity, and also just passers-by. There are chairmen, so the Mwenyekiti is the chairman. They take topics and they have this kind of very orderly discussion where people give passionate speeches, but often they're giving speeches to people of different faiths, people of different tribal ethnic backgrounds, and they're constantly negotiating the sensitive topics. I mean, these particular tents, there was one dedicated to sports, one dedicated to politics, and another dedicated to culture, and I would go to the culture one with Joseph. And Joseph really learned his trade about speaking across difference and engaging in interfaith dialogue at these spaces. And it's the exact kind of discourse that we see here that he brings to the Buddha Hall. So I obviously spent a lot of time as well drinking coffee in Tanzania, and it was one of the best ways to learn Swahili, actually. So now moving on to the fieldwork. So while I was there, every Sunday, Joseph ran an event where buses would head out into the suburbs, and his volunteers would recruit people to come each week to have a meal at the temple and then also discuss Buddhism. The first half was basically in Swahili, conducted by Joseph, and then the second would have the master come out, the abbot, the Chinese Buddhist master, and he would give a speech, and they'd have question and answer, etc., and a lot of prayer and sort of other rituals in between. But what I want to focus on here is the way in which Joseph presented Buddhism as through a comparative project that was always referencing, and the questions that came up in these sessions were always emerging from the Tanzanian context. So be that Christian or Muslim concern, or sort of issues that are common in Dar es Salaam. Now, one example that happened almost every week was at the start of every session, Joseph would quickly calm everyone down about the statues in the room, because people who are Protestants or Muslims are worried about representations of God and worried about worshipping statues. So he would say that these aren't statues. They're not the sanamu that we talk about in Swahili. They are instead akin to friends on the street that help you out when you call them. Or at other times, he talked about the spirits of the Wazaramo tribe, so that are used and called on in particular social contexts. He even talked about them as superheroes. So there was different metaphors he was using. And then the offerings to the statues were similarly explained as not sacrifices, but instead just the courteous, the Tanzanian tradition of allowing elders to eat first. So there was all these ways in which similarities and differences were being constructed right from the get-go, but preempting the concerns of the audience, really. So I won't get into all of these topics, but there were a wide number of topics discussed over the year. The one common question which you might be interested in is, they would often say, in Tanzania, we believe in God, or the Christians and Muslims, we all believe in one God. What about Buddhism? And this answer to the question took a while to settle, but eventually it was settled that God is may seem like the creator of heaven and earth, but in fact is just the heavenly king of the first Buddhist heaven. And that way they sort of integrated these cosmologies. There was also discussions on vegetarianism, marriage, and things like everyday religion. How do you greet someone? If for Muslims, salam alaikum is the greeting. What is the Buddhist greeting? What do they wear? When do they pray? All of these kind of issues were discussed in a comparative way. So aside from specific questions and answers about issues, there was also readings from a book of quotes. And what Joseph did was he would introduce the Chinese quote in Swahili, and then ask the audiences to think of any Swahili idioms called methalis that might have a similar meaning. And in doing so, he established the sort of commensurable wisdoms of these different traditions, but then also in his explanations, it gave a sense of moving towards conceptual clarity or gaining something in a sort of very open and philosophical discussion that was run through a sort of Socratic method. He would always ask people their opinions first and then weave their answers into his discussion. So a classic example is the very famous Mathali Asiye Kuwepo Nalake Halipo, which means the person who is not in sight finds that their portion is not present, normally used to criticize children for being late home and not getting dinner. But in this case, he reinterprets this Mathali in the idiom of mindfulness. So if you're not there present mindfully at home, you're thinking about work, you're missing out on things at home, and vice versa. So you get this conversation through these metaphors and quotes that establish a commensurability of the wisdom involved. Now, after a couple of months of these sessions, there was questions about how to become a Buddhist, and then there was an ordination, not an ordination, a refuge ceremony. So taking the 3 refuges is the ritual that gets done. And Joseph spent an entire session the week prior advertising and also explaining this. And it's important to note that, he distinguished between being a student of Buddhism, a follower and a believer, and said that we're not either of the latter two. We are students and we remain students. We come with our questions. And he says we come to this religion with our sanity. He also compares to baptism, and at the very end gives a touching comment about the sacrament and to drive home the sort of spiritual importance of this ritual. So this ended up with 8 young men in March 2023 taking refuge and becoming Buddhists. And these people then went out and established kind of local Buddhist groups in the suburbs, which I'm going to talk to you about very shortly. This is just a clip from the ordination ceremony. There's some interesting things that happen in terms of language, but I probably won't have time to get into that right now. I want to get to the next section. So I've given you a little bit of a sense of the kind of discursive or the interfaith dialogue, we could call it, or the conversations that unfolded in the Buddha Hall. But there was also a material element and things that were outside of sort of discursive control and the framework of conversation, perhaps. And that those include witchcraft, spirit possession, and Buddhist amulets. So to start off with the Buddhist amulets, these objects were very common in the temple. Everyone who came to the temple would be given one, and when the monks went out, they would also give them to everyone that asked, or didn't ask. Actually, they would give them as gifts. And it was about a broader argument that Buddhist practices like recitation of the Buddha's name or chanting or praying could protect from some of the sort of spiritual forces in Tanzania that people worried about, including witchcraft and satanic forces, etc., etc. So when Joseph was asked by the audience whether or not Buddhism could protect against these things, he said yes, but he said that they could not harm others, they could only protect you. So there's already this contestation or attempt to define the spiritual power contained within these amulets, but then they become a symbolic and contested object. So some people, when they put them on, experience a headache. Other people lose their bad dreams, so their dreams are great, so they have a good experience. Other people picked them up and said, hey, this is witchy stuff. And this is very similar to what goes on regarding debates about Pentecostalism in Tanzania, and whether or not they're in sort of anyway, I won't go into that right now. Suffice to say, they became contested symbolic objects. Now, there are lots of kind of deep metaphor or commonalities in religious semiotic forms, and this is just another example. I could have shown you charms and other good luck objects that are used in Tanzanian context, but here you see the tasbiri. So this is the Islamic prayer beads, and they look exactly like the Buddhist ones. And this is the prayer counter, which is also the exact same model. These were found in Zanzibar. So it just shows how the material context actually does shape a lot of what's going on here. And I could talk about Buddhist robes and all the other material aspects that form this these semiotic forms. So one thing that happened in the second half of 2023 was that there would be visits to these local Buddhist studies groups, and normally it would start off by giving amulets, a short conversation between the monks and the local leader and their group, and then chanting, walking meditation, recitation of the Buddha's name. But what was surprising was that during this process, almost every time there was a visit to a local group, there would be instances of spirit possession. And during the Buddhist chanting, people would fall down, a couple of people perhaps, and then people would start, looking after them, giving them great compassion water, trying to perform exorcisms. And then the locals would ask the monks to secure the perimeter and do a sort of ritual to secure the perimeter from bad forces. And even they were asked to pray for injured people, et cetera, et cetera. And what is fascinating is these people have never encountered Buddhism before. So just a quick word about spirit possession in the Swahili coast. There is a lot of literature on this, and Linda Giles's work shows that the spirit world on the Swahili coast, I guess somewhat similar to Indic Tibetan. I mean, I've been reading a little bit about other Buddhist contexts, but is a very cosmopolitan one. They have spirits that are from specific places like Pemba or Ethiopia or Madagascar, and then they have guilds that venerate these particular spirits. But the difference here is that this is an uncontrolled, unplanned context where spirit possession is occurring. And Linda Giles points out that the tenacity of spirit possession is that it is both multifunctional and polysemic, meaning it can have many different interpretations. And I think these cases clearly have many interpretations that we can talk about. But one of them is that clearly there is a highly cosmopolitan spiritual world or cosmology underpinning these contexts. And the fact that it only happened in the communities and not in the temple shows that there's a spatial element to this cosmology. But that Chinese spiritual forces, like these Buddhist monks and their prayers, were immediately considered as compatible and commensurable with these forces. So finally, just wrapping up with the theory. So as I was thinking about these engagements, one word that came to mind repeatedly was this notion of cosmopolitanism. In this section, I want to talk to you about some of the reading I've done on this theory and what I've come up with, I suppose. So the history of the word cosmopolitanism goes back to ancient Greece, and it has a very Eurocentric history that's first coined by Diogenes, then picked up by the Stoics, and then by Kant, famously in his project for perpetual peace. It's a core element of sort of modern liberalism. And then after the world wars, it reemerges in the forms of human rights discourses. So this recognition that there is a shared humanity, and that engaging across those within shared humanity is an important thing. Now, in the 1990s and 2000s, cosmopolitanism gets picked up again by social scientists, which is kind of unique because previously it was mainly the realm of political philosophy, moral philosophy. And they acknowledge that this term has a very Eurocentric history that has given it particular intellectual baggage. So a universal scope of all of humanity, a secular assumption of secularity being core to it, and also an emphasis on mobility. And while some people have criticized the term for its Eurocentric connotations, others have sought to decolonize it. And that's what I want to try to do here. So this new cosmopolitanism that emerged in the publications I show you on the screen here looked at actually existing cosmopolitanism in the world. So instead of sort of theoretical arguments for how we might engage with others, it looked for ways people do engage with others in various contexts around the world. And this was described as vernacular cosmopolitanism, rooted cosmopolitanism, or subaltern cosmopolitanism. And it's based on the assumption that actually people all around the world have come into contact with others, not just Western, colonial, even missionary, these kind of people, that in fact there are places with highly pluralistic social contexts. We've just heard about the Indian context, which is a fantastic example of this. But then also the Swahili coast represents itself as a fascinating example. And I won't have time to tell you everything about the Swahili coast, obviously, but the couple of things that emerge that sort of make it an interesting place to look at cosmopolitanism. Firstly, it's regularly described as cosmopolitan in the Africanist literature. The Swahili language itself is a product of a relationship between Arabic-speaking traders and Bantu people. The notion of the Swahili identity is also a fluid one, and in historical studies you see this, and I was interested in Vincent's discussion of hierarchy and caste relations. In Swahili towns, you also have a very hierarchical social structure. However, there's an open bottom which allows people and allows the integration of people from lots of different contexts. And also politics in Tanzania is very deeply engaged in interfaith dialogues. This is a meeting we went to every month of religious leaders in Tanzania where they discuss interfaith harmony, etc. And the very nation is built on a pact between Zanzibar and Tanzania, or Tanganyika. So there's a lot of interreligious dialogue going on. So what does this case study tell us about cosmopolitanism? Well, I think that we can meaningfully combine the literature and the anthropology of ethics with cosmopolitanism. So I've found it useful to think of cosmopolitanism as not one thing, but in fact a set of different ethical projects that engage with others or display a willingness to engage with others. So how might we distinguish them? I think out of all the literature that has talked about cosmopolitanism in different places, we can see that there are various forms, and they differ in some ways, but share also some other things. And I think if we're going to broaden the scope, we also need to have some limits to see what cosmopolitan really means. And I think the things that differ, clearly, and I'm using Foucault's framework for analyzing ethical projects, these 4 questions, 4-fold framework, they differ in their goals, of course. You can have a cosmopolitan project in anthropology that seeks to learn from people through engagement across difference, or a missionary one which seeks to change them. But there's also different assumptions about the individual. So we assume maybe in the sort of Kantian cosmopolitanism that it has to be a secular person because any religious identity is parochial and limiting. But in fact, you know, in a lot of cases, the, say, Muslim identity is one that opens you up to transnational connections and, you know, links of kinship and patron-client relations and religious affiliation. So the subject being a secular one is also not a standard across all these different cosmopolitan projects. But they do seem to share a couple of things. I mean, firstly, at the bare minimum, they're interested in conversations across difference. So that's the ethical work that it takes to kind of cultivate this project. But then also in the mode of subjectification. So how this project impresses itself on the individual, and it does so, I argue, as a set of resources. And that's why you can't say a whole culture is cosmopolitan, but you can say that a culture has affordances for a cosmopolitan ethical project. So this is some ways I think we can clarify the literature on cosmopolitanism by bringing it into conversation with the anthropology of ethics. So very briefly, a couple of thoughts on sort of concluding thoughts. We're seeing, as opposed to the very long conversation that's already gone on in India, we're seeing the start of a conversation between Buddhism and the Tanzanian context. But one that is not disrupting a stable and unchanging whole, but is joining a pluralistic urban context where these discussions have been going on for hundreds of years. Also, I think it's important to recognize that all parties are changed in the process of this conversation as a tapestry of similarities and differences are produced that compare these different traditions. Also, clearly, there's a crucial role of the local leader in mission contexts and Indigenous leadership, and something we can definitely talk about more. But also the kind of role of translation. I wanted to make a point here about the way we think about translation across cultures and as kind of like a bridge. In this case, really, you have a very narrow footbridge connecting these two communities who don't have a common language, right? The Chinese don't speak English and the Tanzanians mainly speak Swahili. So this bridge actually created different linguistic spaces and created linguistic boundaries, which allowed for the Tanzanian community to come to terms with Buddhism in their own language, on their own terms. And in doing so, created a possibility of cohabitation or shared identity, but precisely through the sort of linguistic boundaries. And you think of a bridge, if it was a 4-lane highway, there would be a lot more chances for collision. But instead of having just one translator controlling the message, that actually made it quite it was a productive thing for this particular context. And then lastly, I hope that we can understand a little bit more about cosmopolitan ethics on the Swahili coast and more broadly the anthropology of cohabitation across difference. So I'll stop there and really looking forward to the discussion and the questions.
Thank you so much, Theo. it was a really insightful and rich presentation, since I felt that you brought us step by step into research trip, into research fieldwork. So you gave us a lot of details and data that you collected. So I found it very innovative and interesting topic. Thank you so much, really. And okay, I think we can start the Q&A session and the discussion. So don't know if anyone wants to ask something to our speakers or yes, so please go ahead if you have any questions, comments, curiosities. I can break the ice. So, I have actually a curiosity for Vincent. Don't know. Okay, I can see you. So, no, I was just wondering if you could, if you feel, tell us something about your personal experience as both Indigenous, Adivasi, and Christian, especially in your personal experience in your own communities, that is around Kuruk communities in Chhattisgarh, if I'm not wrong. So if you could tell us something about your personal experience, and then a second question, or maybe it's just some. I'm going to ask you some thoughts. How it's maybe a difficult question, but I'm curious to know your thoughts. How an effective interreligious dialogue which kind of this interreligious dialogue can values the perspective on indigenous people? What are your thoughts about it? I don't know, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
My personal experience as an indigenous person and also a Christian, and in a country where Christianity is a tiny minority, and to be a Christian and a tribal or an indigenous person is a very unique experience, where I find that Christianity has done a lot of good to the tribal communities. I'm including myself also in that community who have experienced the goodness of Christianity in various forms. So, in the area where I come from, the Urans are largely populated, and most of the tribals or the Urans are now Catholics, Christians in that area, and because of Christianity, I can say that people in that particular region came up in life, because Christianity brought them education, Christianity brought them empowerment, Christianity brought self-respect, a transformation, and also it gave us opportunity to explore various other avenues in life. So that way, I have a very positive experience of the Christian mission as such in the region and in the communities where I come from. I have heard in other parts of the world, in Canada and the USA, how Christianity and the system of education has deprived people from their cultures and their traditions and so on. Maybe it was not exactly the same in India. Uh, Now and then we hear people accusing that Christianity deprived tribals from their own traditions, cultures, and religious practices, and so on. But I rediscover, after being Christian, I discover or rediscover my indigenous roots in a more authentic and meaningful way by connecting Christian faith and the traditional faith system, because I was also uh, uh, teaching tribal theology. So I know how theology is connected very closely with the Christian experience, the tribal theology, tribal understanding of God, tribal understanding of the cosmos, of the humanity, is very closely, I feel, is connected with the Christian faith and practice of life, death, and life after death. How the concept of God, concept of universe is conceptualized in Christian terms is very close to the understanding of tribal worldview, and that's why Christianity becomes a kind of fulfillment of unfulfilled desire in the traditional faith system. That is what I feel, because in the Christianity, a kind of concrete manifestation of God's love and experience we have, whereas in the traditional practices of our traditional faith system, we had kind of God invisibly experienced, although his presence was felt, experienced in everything, everywhere, but visibly, like in a very revealed form, God being human is not there. So I feel this is a fulfillment of the same faith practice in Christianity. So that is my personal experience. It has brought about my personal change in me, and also it has empowered me to what I am today. Second question you asked, how interfaith or interreligious faith is more meaningful in terms of the multi-religious context in India. Uh, Tribals as such, if I talk of the traditional cultures and practices, has no need or no desire for a kind of interreligious faith practice, because the indigenous system of worship or experiencing God is uh, autonomous, I can say, autonomous or independent in itself, which has nothing to do with other practice of show off, or other practice of rituals, which is kind of periodic, which is place based, whereas in traditional practices there is no binding of a particular place or particular type of ritual, but it is a kind of a spontaneous expression of one's faith experience. So but with the coming of Christianity, many things are streamlined, systematized, and ritual practices became more important. And that's how I think for Christianity, there is a much more need for interfaith dialogue than for traditional practices of the tribals. But in the multi-religious and multi communities in India, a kind of common platform, what I was speaking about, of which welcomes everyone, a kind of platform where no one is excluded, where is love becomes a kind of supreme rule of law, where acceptance becomes, harmony becomes, a kind of mutual understanding of coexistence becomes a kind of a rule of the day, then that is a kind of a desired uh, place where everyone would like to come. Otherwise, we have temples, we have worship places where it is exclusively written Christians and dogs are not allowed to enter. That kind of exclusive type of practice is not appreciated, and I feel there is a urgent need for a common ground, common platform to articulate certain things. Therefore, what at the end I was saying, the fourfold interfaith dialogue and its practice is very important, where dialogue of life, dialogue of religious experiences, dialogue of action, dialogue of theological experiences becomes part of the life, where it is our everyday practice, not only to speak, not only for a particular time and day for ritual practice, but it is every time a practice. Like action itself is dialogue. Our life itself is dialogue. So that I think is the need of the day. So that is what I feel that brings more equality and just practice among the communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answers. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I don't know if anyone else have some comments or questions, even Theo and Vincent themselves, if they want to comment each other. I don't know. Feel free.
Yeah, I have lots of questions. I thought that was such an interesting talk, and the first one, I guess, was when you were talking about how people were attracted, Indigenous communities were attracted to the missions. You were talking about education, and I was wondering what particularly about the education was it that attracted them? Was it sort of language acquisition, or were they also, like in Africa, I know that the missions also went around with telescopes and also introduced modern like agricultural techniques and these kind of things. So there was a strong element of technology being used in this. So how do you reflect on that?
Yeah, in the indigenous communities in India, education actually involved many areas of life, not only imparting knowledge, but also empowering people through their by bringing their everyday use in the curriculum, like training them how to cultivate, training them how to be a kind of better mason, better carpenter, or how to know about land, how to have feasts and other things also being celebrated, so that the life and practice of the people was brought into the curriculum of that time. Although the Western education and the Western system of imparting knowledge that became dominant, but what I felt is other areas of life which was their everyday practice, when they found in the curriculum, that that helped them to be attracted towards education.
Yep. Another follow-up was about you talked about indigenous cosmologies and practices as fitting well, or being described well, or being fulfilled, even the desire of the unfulfilled desires of tribal life, as you put it, like fulfilled with Christianity. I was wondering what the sort of most strong connections or common kind of concerns are, and follow-up question is kind of where do you see these as universal concerns for humanity, or do you see this as a special relationship between the gospel, Christianity, and indigenous traditions? Or do you think it's reflective of something that we all share across all religions?
Yeah, there is in the myths and stories, in the traditional practices, there is a lot of a revelation of God in various forms in traditional belief systems, which is not a very obvious manifestation or revelation, but God, the invisible God, whom they would, the supreme being, whom they may call in different names, but he takes a form of different individuals to to rectify a certain wrong, and he goes back. So at one point, that God who is invisible comes down among the people, and mysteriously he disappears. When they come to Christianity, then the incarnation, the event of incarnation becomes very clear, when the invisible God becomes human, lives among the people, experiences the ups and downs of life with the people. So that becomes more clear. There is no mystery shrouded within that, because this sun becomes a kind of more manifest, revealed. So that way, the unfulfilled desire of trying to find God among us, among me, is fulfilled when I practice this and experience God becoming human and living among us. So that way, there are many instances where I find that this kind of unrevealed reality becomes very much revealed and clear with the Christian practice.
Right. That's fascinating. Sorry if I can ask one more question.
Yeah.
So I don't know much about it, but I do know that there's a big conversion by Dalit people to Buddhism, I think in like the 1950s, I could be wrong. And I was wondering about your perspective on this. Like, you described the one of the benefits of Christianity is giving a level platform that goes beyond caste. And it strikes me that the Buddha 2,500 years ago was fundamentally criticizing the caste system as like one of the points of difference with the local culture. So I was wondering whether or not like people who have converted to Buddhism have found, like, is there any difference between sort of converting to, say, a world religion like Buddhism in this case, or Christianity, or do you think they both provide that like sense of empowerment, new identity, moving beyond caste system, etc.?
Yes, these two categories of people. One is Dalits, one category of people, tribals, another category of people in Indian population, I can say. So these Dalits are basically the socially marginalized communities who live in close proximity with the dominant communities. Tribals are not socially marginalized, but geographically marginalized and culturally marginalized, and living in close proximity with the natural surrounding, away from people or the mainstream society. So these two main differences are there. And when Dalits are very much experiencing discrimination, oppression, unjust practice on them by the very people with whom they are living in the surrounding. So they were in search of some kind of a liberation which would bring a kind of freedom from such kind of oppression, unjust practices, and give them human dignity. So at this point of time, if Christianity was in touch with them, or the Buddhism, whatever came in front of them as a liberating element, liberating force, they were drawn towards it. They found that this gives equality, this gives dignity, this has no oppressive practice upon me. So Buddhism became more acceptable, because in Buddhism there is a more uh, acceptance and equality, where Ambedkar, the great leader of Dalit community and also later on of India, he himself accepted Buddhism. In the Christianity, he said, Christianity still has a kind of, as I said, the baggage of caste and race practice is there in the mindset of Christians, even though they became Christians. But from the Hindu baggage, they carried that hierarchical practice even when they became Christians. So that Dalits found that even within Christianity, there is a hierarchy. The practice of caste structure is still there, surviving in Christianity, but not in Buddhism. So that made them to accept in greater number the Buddhism among the Dalit communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
I have two questions, actually curiosities for Theo, but don't know if someone else want to ask. I will go after. Don't know if there are any questions for our speakers. Okay. So I will ask. So actually, only one curiosity about your fieldwork. If you face some not only ethical but in general challenges in conducting this research, and how did people perceive your position, let's say. So this is just curiosity. And another question, I don't think it's related to your research properly, but it came to my mind, is about, you mentioned witchcraft and spirit possession. So I don't know if you also researched about if you could say more about the perspective of people towards these women. I think most of all are women that are considered possessed, like witches, if I understood well, but I don't know.
Yeah.
If you could say more about the perspective, if is this something considered very negative or not from the people of the communities in Tanzania? Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, good questions. So the first one on positionality is quite interesting. The temple was basically half Tanzanian people and half Chinese people. So monks, volunteers, visitors often, but the people living there, it was kind of half-half. And the Tanzanians there were children in the orphanage, there was workers, and there were also kind of volunteers. And Joseph represented the kind of the first person to sort of be a Buddhist leader at the temple. But anyway, so my positionality obviously is not Tanzanian or Chinese, and it helped because I think there was a lot of privilege in that position, because I was kind of able to be a third party. The fact that I speak Chinese and Swahili very much helped me build relationships with both sides, and it did become awkward at times. Like, of course, there were, in other chapters I talk about things like temple management and sort of conflicts between sort of models of value of wage labor compared to spiritual volunteering and these kind of questions of resource distribution and stuff. And I was often caught in the middle because I was a translator. A lot of the time for these daily issues, I would have to be the person in between. And so observing, it gave me a great opportunity to observe these interactions, but also put me in a difficult position where I was often kind of pulled to either side at certain stages. And so I had to manage that pretty carefully. So on the second question of witchcraft and spirit possession, so yeah, it's quite complicated. There are, firstly, it wasn't all women. There were men also who were possessed, and as I said, it's a polysemic kind of experience. So there's many different things that it could be and interpreted as. But there are different models of spirit possession that go on. So there's like these spirit guilds where they do dances with drums to actually call a spirit to possess someone, and then there are like Pentecostal exorcisms, which are very common, where people are possessed and then there's an exorcism performed. Now, these were kind of more similar to the Pentecostal version, I think, in the sense that they were seemingly uncontrolled, a spirit entering into the body. So in Chinese, the futi, or in spirit possession, or or kupata mapepo in Swahili. Like, the experience is not framed negatively or positively. It actually is interpreted afterwards in a way. So the people who were possessed, who were then cured or exorcisms were performed, often came back to the temple after that every week, because they had felt the power, sort of some effects of what was going on. They're not witches. So I actually didn't talk about witchcraft and discussions of witchcraft that much because I didn't have time. But this spirit possession is somewhat distinct from witchcraft. The only time that it was connected was when sometimes in these visits they would say, oh, someone has been cursed and they have a problem, and could you please say some mantras and pray for these people. But yeah, no, it's distinct, and there's no like shaming or anything. In fact, it's like perhaps even a good thing in a sense to be possessed and to have this experience. It can be a cleansing, purifying experience, I suppose. But I want to also be careful of assuming the meaning of these events, because I think the point is that they are polysemic and that they are open for interpretation. And that's what I was trying to get at in this argument, which is that a lot of the things, while they seem like dialogue and controlled sort of comparison, sometimes it's out of control of any one person and is very embodied and uncontrollable and indeterminate.
Thank you so much. No, actually, I was wondering because witchcraft is also a very current and sensitive issue even among Indigenous Adivasi communities in India. So, yeah, it is often related to the women's role and position in the Indigenous society. So, yeah, I got interested even in the perception in your context, let's say.
It'd be very interesting to hear about the way Christianity has engaged with witchcraft in India, because in Africa, it's become a central concern. Pentecostal, like independent African churches doing exorcisms and engaging with witchcraft, anyway, but I'd be interested to hear what Vincent has to say about that.
No, nothing to add, because Marina has been to that area and she knows how this practice is still prevalent in the very rural areas. Even they have become Christians, or they are influenced by the Christian communities nearby and so on. But that has become kind of deep-rooted a practice, like the caste practice is there still among Christians in a caste society. In the case of tribals, although they don't practice caste, but this baggage of practice, some kind of superstitious practice, we can say, of witchcraft and of naming and shaming, especially the women, that continues now and then in some places. So this has also deep rooted in the culture of the people, although the state, the government, people trying to do away with it, but now and then we still hear this, especially the oppression and also exploitation of women because of this practice. So it is deeply rooted and found also now in India.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for your answers. Don't know if there are other comments, questions. Okay. Okay, if there are no questions or comments, I think we can go in towards the conclusion of this meeting. So I'd like to thank all of you. So Theo, Vincent, and all the people that joined us today. thank you for your insightful, very rich presentations and for the discussion. And thank also to our audience for taking the time to join us. I will share in the chat just the CRASSH webpage and the ISDG webpage. If you know, or if you want to know more about our upcoming events. There will be two important events. One on March the 6th, yes, and it will be a topic related to the today topic. And on March the 6th, there will be a panel on reverse mission, Indigenous-led re-evangelizing of Western Christian contexts. So there will be this panel, and then on March the 23rd, there will be an event, a very important event, but it is in person, and it is part of the Cambridge Festival. And this event will host a music band, the Quechua music band, that will give a concert of indigenous Andean music, and then it will be followed by a Peruvian puppetry workshop by Jose Navarro Theater. So these will be the two upcoming events. I will share the web page. So for more information about our group too, there is, okay. Yeah. Okay. So thank you again for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon, and I hope to see you in the next upcoming events. So have a nice day, and thanks a lot.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you to other audience also.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot to everyone. Bye.